Greetings, everyone. This is Live Life Well TV host Robert Landau, and this is another episode of Health and Wellness Tips. This episode, we're going to tackle a very pertinent topic. As a matter of fact, it's been around for a long time, and it seems to be becoming more of a potent and powerful force as time moves forward. What am I talking about? The nightly news. This is an episode of Health and Wellness Tips on how to manage the nightly news. Stay tuned. There are a couple of new disorders, I think is the best way to name them, that have resulted because many of us tend to be addicted to nightly news or morning news or afternoon news or 24-hour news. So there are two new disorders that are starting to be called so due to the effects of immersing oneself into too much news. There's something called news anxiety, believe it or not. And there is also something else called headline stress disorder. And I really shouldn't laugh at that because these are actually serious psychological, mental conditions. And again, they've resulted because many of us watch too much news each and every day. My father was a perfect example of that. Dinner always had to be served growing up at 6:30 because dinner could only last 29 minutes. Why? Because you might remember at 7 p.m., at least on East Coast time, the nightly news would come on from 7 to 7:30, and you got a choice. At that time, it was NBC, ABC, or CBS. Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, you might remember some of those names. And my father, I don't remember which one he was hooked on. I think it might have been the NBC Nightly News, Huntley Brinkley. But wow, if dinner wasn't finished by 6:59, he would get up from the table and go into the living room, sit in his chair, get the remote, which was a new thing back then, and tune in to the NBC Nightly News. And my father was somebody who had great up energy, very effervescent, very positive. And I would watch him as he would sit down to watch the news. He would sit down just waiting to hear the stories of the day. And the first one usually was the most negative, violent, and profound. And so I would watch his whole countenance, even though I was watching him from the back of the living room, his whole posture, his whole countenance, his whole energy would change and shift. 5 minutes into the broadcast, 10 minutes into the broadcast, he was kind of halfway down on his chair. And if I could see his expression on his face, it probably would have been like this. By the end of the broadcast at 7:29, my father needed help getting up from the chair, and he wasn't that old in those days. Why? Because he was carrying the weight of the world as relayed in that specific news broadcast that he was watching on his shoulders. In effect, he ended up becoming the energy of all the stories that he had watched for that 29 minutes or so. I mean, the commercials didn't even cheer him up. And that's fine if he did that for one night, but every single night until I left the house to go to college, my father was doing that, and he did that well into his latter years. So He taught me not to do that, not to have that kind of connection to wanting to know what's going on in the world. I think there's something in between with not wanting to expose yourself to any negativity concerning the news and wanting to know everything. There's a middle ground there, but it's up to you to control it so that you don't end up becoming a stat in the news anxiety figures or a stat or number in headline stress disorder figures. Here's what you can do to manage watching the news, yes, on a daily basis. First of all, psychologically, accept that some things, well, maybe a lot of things, are really outside of your control. This way you can watch things without becoming the energy of those things, because really there's not much you can do to change the course of those things. Also, really work at managing how much time you spend watching the news each and every day. And if it's at all possible, please don't watch the news before you go to sleep. Because what happens if and when you do, you carry all of that energy of what you just opened yourself to while you're lying in bed or on the sofa watching TV just before you go to bed. You carry that into your sleep state. So you might not have a relaxed sleep, and you might not feel that great when you wake up the next morning. Also, consider the source. Now, I don't want to be negative about the news media, but I'll give you my personal opinion. I think a lot of it might be ratings based. These news networks, as far as I'm concerned, allegedly know what really will hit you. And to keep you glued to the screen, sometimes those reports may not be of a very positive nature and maybe slightly exaggerated or possibly misreported just to create an effect. Just a possibility here, but I want you to consider the source, because look at it this way. If you were to watch the same story, the same news story, on each of the cable news networks, the local news networks, the nightly news networks and such, you would probably get 10 different versions of that story. Which one is correct? We'll never know. Also, keep yourself in a positive environment as much as possible. So when that bad news hits, you always have a safe place to retreat to, and you don't end up feeling so vulnerable based on the story that you just heard. Keep friends and family close. If you're particularly disturbed after watching the news one night or morning or afternoon, call a family member. Go visit a friend. Go to an activity and get some other energy flowing into your present moment. Also, at social functions, make a plan to not discuss the news. I remember when my parents used to entertain friends in our house. I think before dinner and possibly during much of dinner, because I never had dinner when my parents had friends and associates over. But I remember before dinner, most of the conversation in the living room was about current events. And people would get into heated arguments because people would take sides. And it just wasn't a great thing to move from and sit down in the dining room and have a dinner together after you had a heated political discussion. So maybe designate no news zones when you have get-togethers or when you find yourself at get-togethers, so you can celebrate getting together as opposed to what you saw on the news 2 hours before or 2 weeks before. Always balance the negative with the positive. Don't stay in a negative state after you've heard a particularly troubling news story. Do something to distract yourself. Watch another channel. Watch a sitcom. Tell jokes with a friend, or call again a family member. When you distract your brain and your mind and give it something else to fix on, then you can leave the distressing news that you saw in the past instead of take it with you in the present, then possibly affecting your future. And finally, and you heard me say this in a couple of ways in this episode, choose not to become the news that you heard. Treat it as that, news. Don't worry about what's going to happen too much. And if you find yourself doing that, that's okay. But then choose to lift yourself up and out of that negative, worrisome victimization energy and move to the next step in your day or evening. This way you put news in its proper perspective. Maybe like right here instead of here. There's a difference between just making it a little part of your day or evening or a huge part of your day or evening. It is always up to you. So, with your balanced health in mind, I hope some of these tips might help you put the news in its proper place and perspective. And now this news broadcast comes to a close. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host, with another episode of Health and Wellness Tips. God bless.